Minister of Iceland, Katrin Jakobsdóttir. She joins us from Reykjavik. Mrs. Prime Minister, thank you very much for being with us today.
Very happy to be with you.
Mrs. Prime Minister, Iceland has 1,792 confirmed cases of COVID-19, 10 deaths. So it means both an infection rate and a mortality rate of less than 0.5%. Before we get to how you've reached that result, I want to ask you a very simple question. Do you consider that in your country, the pandemic is fully under control?
I would say that the pandemic is not over, but we have it under a relatively good control. We have from the beginning in February taken just over 46,000 tests, and we have used the method of tracing infections. So new infections now are very few. They have been from 0 up to 2 in the last few days. So yes, I think we are gaining control over the pandemic, but obviously there have been strong social restrictions. We are planning to open up again, lifting the first restrictions next week, and then we will follow the procedure very closely, what will happen.
Right. So going back to the method, there's been no lockdown. Schools and shops have been open. Air travel is still up and running, but no other country in the world has tested as extensively. You just mentioned this figure, over 46,000 people have been tested. This is some 12% of your population. Compared to, let's say, Germany, which has been heralded as an example of mass testing, it's only 2% of the population. Why did you decide to do this from the very beginning?
Well, the Icelandic population is around 360,000. So yes, 46,000, just over 46,000 people have been tested, and this has both been done to people with symptoms, but also with the general public, and it has been done in cooperation. The public health authorities on one side, and then a company called Decode Genetics that have been actually collaborating on this extensive testing. This was decided early in the beginning to start this collaboration. And this has given us really because we are on an island. You mentioned air travel. Obviously, air travel to and from the country is very limited. We are the outer border of the Schengen area in Europe, so air travel has been limited. So we have been very much focusing on containing the virus and aiming for elimination here in Iceland.
Right.
And this was actually part of the plan, really, from the beginning.
Right. From the beginning, there has been this cooperation between the public health authorities and the private sector, as you just mentioned. How many tests are you planning to conduct? Because you have tested people with symptoms, but also without symptoms, which hasn't been the case in most of the countries.
Well, yes, we have done a lot of tests, and then we have done a lot of tracing. So most of the people actually who are being analyzed with COVID, they are already quarantined when they are analyzed, because we trace the infections around and contact everybody who has been in contact with infected persons. What we plan to do, are hoping to be able to do in the next few weeks, is to have a large-scale testing on if the population has developed an antibiotic in their blood against the COVID. This might happen in the month of May, and then we would like to do a large-scale testing on that. But then we will just see what happens as the weeks go by, because it's very difficult to predict the development of the virus, obviously.
Right. You mentioned contact tracing. This has also been a key. Obviously, it's easier to do when you have a small population and you're on an island, but you've done this partly through an application on a smartphone. Has this been efficient, and have there been some privacy issues? There's a debate in many countries, including here in France, about how much privacy do you prey on by tracing everyone and its contacts?
Yes, obviously there are benefits in being an island and being a small population, so it's relatively a lot easier to trace people who have come in contact with infected persons. I think we have about 93% success rate when it comes to that. And then we have been using quarantine, and actually around 18,800 people have finished quarantine in Iceland, which is quite a large chunk of the population. We still have around 700 people in quarantine. The tracing app is something that we designed. Obviously, there was a discussion about the privacy issues, and this is not an obligational app. This is something that you can just choose to use. Quite a lot of people have decided to download that app and use it. It is strictly it's under a strict supervision of the Institute for Personal Privacy, and the information that are gathered there are to be really destroyed after a certain amount of time, and are not to be used for any other purpose than tracing infections. But it's obviously it's something that needs to be discussed in society, and it was discussed, and it's not obligational.
Right. You mentioned earlier that there would be a lessening of the restrictions on May 4th, or for instance, the public gathering, which were limited to 20 people until now, now will be up to 50 people. Preschools, grade schools would operate as usual. Are you confident that this will not create a second wave of the virus infection? For instance, you had not quarantined people coming into Iceland, and you've decided a few days ago that there would be a 2-week quarantine for the people coming in. So it shows that you are still concerned about a potential second wave, as it's known.
Well, obviously there is still so much that we do not really know about this virus, and we need to take every precaution. We're lifting restrictions, as you mentioned, on the 4th of May. Then preschools and primary schools will go back to normal operation. They have been operating though, because we have tried to follow strict regulations really coming from the World Health Organization in testing, tracing, using quarantine and isolation. But we have tried to keep the society going, and hopefully this will also help us to restart the society more. We are now, yes, we have a quarantine plan for 2 weeks for everybody who comes to Iceland, and we will revise that decision on the 15th of May. Then we will see how it's developing. And we will obviously follow the process of the virus very closely after the restrictions are lifted on 4th of May. If it will go up again, we might have to have more restrictions again. You might have noticed that from Germany to Taiwan to New Zealand to Northern Europe, women leaders have been hailed as doing actually a better job at handling the pandemic than their masculine counterparts. Do you share that assessment? And if so, how do you explain it? Well, you can find examples of male leaders who are doing a good job. I think what we see here in this pandemic is that leaders who follow the advice of scientists and take transparent decisions really about what measures to be taken because of the pandemic, they are doing well. I think it's very important in a pandemic like this that we are in Iceland, we are an open liberal democracy, and follow those rules. We are not just fighting the virus, we're also following the rules of democracy, and we have tried to keep everything we are doing as transparent as possible. So what has happened here is really that the people themselves have taken a lot of responsibility in containing the virus. We don't have the police on the streets following that we are seeing after that we're all following the rules. It's people themselves who are really doing this because we're all part of the solution, really.
Right. Just a last question, Mrs. Prime Minister. You're the leader of a left-green party. Climate change has been a priority of yours. Are you concerned that because of the pandemic, this agenda will be pushed back in your country and in other countries as well?
Well, in Iceland, we will continue what we have been doing when it comes to climate change. We are aiming for carbon neutrality in 2040 and also aiming to fulfill our obligations in the Paris Agreement by 2030. So we are just moving on as before, but obviously happenings like this pandemic can affect what will happen in the world, and we're already seeing that in international cooperation. It's creating a strain really in international cooperation. But I firmly believe that the climate change issue will come back as our core priority in Europe and the rest of the world when we have finished this pandemic.
Katrin Jakobsdóttir, Prime Minister of Iceland, thank you very much for being with us from Reykjavik, and thank you for watching this interview here on France 24.